Welcome to Restore the Glory podcast. My name is Jake Kim.
And I'm Bob Schutz.
We're two Catholic therapists sharing what we've learned personally and professionally to help you on the journey of restoration. If you've been blessed by our podcast, please prayerfully consider partnering with us on Patreon. Your support will help cover the cost to produce the podcast, but will also give you access to exclusive content like monthly reflections and special live stream teachings. Go to patreon.com/restoretheglory and join the mission of experiencing the restoration of our God-given glory. Hey, Bob. As always, great to be back with you again. We just finished a really cool little series there on therapists and therapy and trying to help people out with just all those kind of questions that we get. So just want to call our listeners' attention back to that. But I had a Freudian slip there, if that's what they call it, where today what we're starting is a new series. This has been one that we've been talking about for quite a while. And I think it's just timing and providence has come together to where now we're starting it now. We don't know exactly how many episodes it's going to be, but what we're about to dive into is a series on healing in leadership. And we have some pretty cool guests coming up that are willing to come on the podcast and share about their experiences of healing and leadership. So today we're just going to open things up and kind of share a little bit about us and kind of put ourselves through what we're going to ask them to go through, I guess, and talk a little bit about just some generic themes that we think are important to set the stage. So anything you want to say to kind of kick us off before we start diving in?
What occurred to me as you were doing the intro is that, in a certain sense, therapists are leaders.
Yeah.
And we were talking about this in relation to the therapist, and now we're just generalizing that idea to every different sphere. And so the leaders we'll have on are representing the church and communities and dioceses and ministries and the workplace. Yeah. And so I think we're going to have a good range of examples. But I think one of the things in our hearts is to introduce the idea and then also share our own experiences, as you said.
Yeah. So here's a couple so maybe section 1 in this episode will be you and I just sharing various ideas about leaders. And then section 2 will be us kind of asking the questions that we're going to ask our leaders. So here's a few thoughts that come to me when I think about leaders and the importance of leaders. It's just one of them is how important they are in the body of Christ. It's hard to think of when you get your head around the concept of leadership. Number one, it's everywhere. Like when we were praying just before we turned on the mics, I really appreciated how you were praying for leadership in all of its various forms, like leadership in the family, right? So a lot of people will just dismiss that as, oh, I'm a dad, but that's not, I don't run a ministry. We hear it where I don't have a podcast or like as if that's some massive change, although sure, there's different responsibilities, but I appreciated how you said leadership's everywhere. So that's just one thing is how critical leadership is, and it's everywhere. Any thoughts with that one?
No, very true. And even in the family, the older children are in a leadership role with younger children, people at school, there are kids in school who are leaders and people follow on sports teams. It just permeates every area. And, in a certain sense, every one of us is called to be a leader, that is to set an example for those who follow.
Yeah, totally. Another thing I think that, is just an interesting point to see is that Jesus, and throughout the scriptures, we see that Jesus, two things come to mind. One, he's the ultimate leader. He's the perfect example of leadership. And I've heard the phrase over and over and over again, what do you see in Jesus as leader? Leadership is self-gift. To me, that's the ultimate definition of what it means to be a leader. Leadership is self-gift. And I want to touch base on that a little bit more here in section 1. But 2, the other thing about the scriptures we see is that how Jesus treats the leaders differently than he treats everybody else. And you see it like if we categorize them, scribes, Pharisees, Sadducees, that would be the religious leaders of the time. The apostles, that the 12, we would even say the 72, those are all groups of leaders. And what's interesting is the scripture addresses them a ton. Like percentage-wise, there's so much attention given to leaders as opposed to non-leaders. Just from as a point of perspective. That fascinates me when you look at it through that lens.
Yeah, and if you go back to the Old Testament, I mean, the whole Old Testament is about the leaders that God appoints.
That's interesting.
Their successes and failures. Right?
Yeah, so true. I mean, yeah, just take David for a second.
Yeah.
A man after God's heart, deeply in love with the Lord, and look at the implications of his leadership positively and negatively. And then the leader he was under, Saul, and that whole relational dynamic. I mean, it's just like these generational dynamics of leaderships, and all these phrases that I'm saying, I know both of us well enough that it's like activating these giant categories of, we could go on that for 7 episodes.
Yeah.
Anyway, so I think here's another category that just comes up here is when we talk about leadership, we have to be conscious and like remind ourselves about the realities of the human heart. Because in leadership, they get almost amplified and exposed. In other words, the quality of your character, the quality of your heart, the wholeness of your heart is really tested in leadership because leadership's about self-gift. So here's some of the realities of the human heart: the desire to be loved, the desire to be affirmed, the desire to be secure. Other realities would be the desire to make a difference. And then woundedness, not having our needs met, lies we believe, on and on and on. Those realities go. Again, theology of the body is our major lens of looking at the world through. So original man and historical man are really important perspectives to lay over the top of a reflection on leadership, to go, right, we are all historical man now in our leadership, but in the beginning it was not so. Shame is a major part of it. Hiding is a major part of it. The desire for like twisted power is a part of it, on and on. So any thoughts there?
Yeah, as you're speaking, I'm thinking of the story of James and John. And, Jesus is telling them his kind of leadership. He's going to go to the cross.
Right.
And we know Peter's reaction to that. We've already dealt with that in another series, and again, that was a series on leadership, the whole thing about Peter.
Yeah.
But with James and John, that here they're trying to vie for position.
Right.
While Jesus is talking about his passion and suffering. And I think there's a certain distortion, if you will, corruption of leadership that's inherent in that story, which is all of our tendency in leadership to look out for our own interest, to take the unmet needs or the disordered desires and turn leadership into something for myself, as opposed to an obedience to Christ, which he said, the Gentiles lord it over one another, but not so among you. The greatest among you is the one who serves. And so go back to your idea of self-gift. It's, true leadership is service. And to whatever extent that we're still living out of our brokenness, and we all do, we're going to look for our own interest and look to use that leadership for our own gain, and it becomes destructive for everybody around us. And, we're all prone to that weakness.
Yeah. Oh, there's so much. that's so true, and there's so much there with that. There's this idea that I came across, and it basically goes like this. Anybody who is vying for a leadership role is not ready for leadership. And it's just this interesting concept of once you know and really appreciate what leadership is, nobody goes, yes, give that to me. Because it's about self-gifts to such a degree that you lose your life. Right. Yes. And so if you want it, you obviously don't understand what it actually is, or you're really, I don't know. It just, because I've seen that. We're like, I'm ready. Put me in, coach. Like, let me be, I want, I want that position. Give it to me. And I'm going, that's unfortunately often a sign of desires in our hearts that we think can be satisfied and healed by having power.
You see that all the way through church history. A lot of the people who are appointed bishops, they want to run the other way,
Right.
I meet so many good holy priests right now who are saying the same thing, just Lord, spare me from being a bishop. I'm willing if you call me, but it's not in my desire, because they see what the bishops go through.
Right.
And who wants to be president? Only somebody that's,
yeah.
a little off balance in terms of thinking that this is going to be an easy thing.
Right.
Or if you go in with your eyes open, then it's a very sobering thing.
Yeah, I mean, the dependency of a leader on the capacity of Christ is huge.
It's huge. Yeah.
And if you don't see that dependency, you and the people you lead are in a lot of trouble.
Yeah, and we're seeing it all over the world right now. I mean, just the impact of leadership that isn't submitted to Christ is devastating beyond imagination.
Right. I mean, let's just take a cross-section of leaders that has ravaged, I think, the Catholic Church, and that would be the sexual scandals. So every one of those priests was a leader.
Yeah.
And I think you and I we haven't really talked about this, but I think you and I would land in a similar spot, that the reasons that those leader priests did the awful things they did was because of real, unaddressed brokenness in their heart, and a dismissal of that brokenness, and almost an engaging in what the brokenness led them to do, unfiltered, unchecked. I mean, there's just all kinds of those dynamics. There's just all kinds of the stuff present in that little cross-section of hiding, living in a facade, inability to be selfless, using your power for your own good instead of the good of the other, right? And look at what the effect is. It's horrible.
Horribly damaging. And then, the number of people in leadership above those, the bishops who were in any way. And again, I have a great deal of compassion for that era and the way that the church handled situations. It wasn't all just covering up and denial, but, those leadership choices and the system that then fosters that kind of secrecy, just the destruction that's done, and, just the huge impacts of that. And that's in the church.
Yes.
We're not even talking, maybe it's worse in the church because there's an expectation of trust that maybe not in other areas of leadership.
Yes. I mean, you just said something, Bob. I think you just said it very simply, and it really jumped out at me. Leadership choices. And I thought, man, that's just a really nice, simple way to put it. Where do the choices of leaders come from? And the Catechism makes it very clear. The place of decision is the heart. The heart is the place where I am, where I reside. And that's kind of, to me, a double nuance when it says I am. It's also the place where I am, but it's also the place where Jesus is. But it's the place of decision. And it's precisely in the human heart where the effect of woundedness is. And if you go back to the fall, you have, to me, the greatest potentially psychological phrase ever penned. I was afraid because I was naked, and so I hid. And that, to me, diagnoses a large portion of what goes on in leadership: fear, shame, and grasping for things that you don't trust that God will provide. And so you take it.
And part of the challenge of leadership is the more visible your leadership, the more likely that those things that aren't acceptable become hidden. It's like, how do I allow this part of me that's broken, or this part of me that's disordered, be seen in the public eye?
Yes.
Because, we know what happens in the public eye. Everything is scrutinized. So it's actually our culture is increasing that tendency of hiding among leaders.
Yes.
And so that's why the healing of leaders is so important. And it doesn't mean that everything becomes exposed to the group that you're leading, but everything needs to be exposed to the light of God and walked into that. And, one of the things that I admire of all the leaders we're going to have on this is they're in that process. And, a good leader is willing to humble himself to say, I have brokenness in this area. I have struggle in this area. I have need in this area.
Right. Yeah, I think you're nuancing something I think that's really important is the value of discretion, but the horrible harm of hiding. And what we're learning, I think, in leadership development kind of things, and one of our guests will be able to speak to this probably really, really well. He's one of the world experts on this, but is the value of having a group of people to where you can be totally transparent, so that you can bring the fruit of those relationships into the masses where it wouldn't be probably appropriate. And that's just across the board. It's not appropriate to have everybody see everything about you. Although if you have things that aren't exposed to some group of people, that's a red flag, And so these inner circles that don't just pat you on the back when you continually fall, but really accompany you into wholeness and freedom, because that's a whole other thing we could go down is, oh, well, I told somebody about it. Well, did they just go, yeah, me too? Let's just keep going and doing our thing. That's not a very helpful group of people that you're sharing it with, right? The kind of people who can say you're in a spot where it's too dangerous and too difficult. You need to step out of leadership. Any thoughts there before? I feel like we're almost ready to go to part 2 here, but.
Yeah, I have so many thoughts, but I'm disciplining myself.
This is really hard. I'm like, we have a 4-part series on introduction to leadership, but there's just so many. Yeah. How about just for a second, just to let our listeners know what the heck we're thinking? We don't have to talk about it, but what are the things that you're thinking just categorically?
Well, I'm thinking, one of the things that I'm thinking a lot of is some of the priests that I know who abused, who went to treatment and brought this out in the open and went back into ministry. And because they didn't deal with the roots of it, then acted it out again, or because it was not a good accountability after that, acted it out again. So it's like even when it's shared, as you were talking about it being shared, even when it's shared, and even when there's a quasi-therapeutic environment, but doesn't get to the root issues, there can be some damage, and where there isn't healthy accountability, healthy sense of, we're going to watch this together. We're going to see where you are. Are you capable of living in freedom in this area?
Man, Bob, I love what you just said, because to me, the word I use there, it really resonates with something I use. And it's very simple, but it's called reality.
Yeah.
And what you're describing there is, are we dealing with the reality of the situation, or are we putting our toes in it and then just going, yeah, that's enough. That's good. Okay. And I find that the Paschal mystery, Jesus' passion, death, resurrection, ascension, is the path for everybody's wholeness and healing and restoration. And the most difficult part, everybody knows how to do resurrection. Well, at least it's way easier to do. Maybe I'll say it that way. Maybe not everybody knows how to do it, but everybody's like, yep, I'll do resurrection. Very few people go, okay, I'll do passion and death. But that's an essential part of the healing journey, because you're putting to death, as Paul would say, the old man, the false self, the sinful nature, all of that stuff, which has belief systems around it, has wounds around it that suggest you need this blank for you to be fulfilled and alive in life. And that blank is the very thing that in a leader's world hurts themselves and other people.
Yes.
And they're convinced that that's where life will be found. And there's the lure of the enemy,
Yeah. Yeah. And, even while we talk about it, it's, there's a certain sobriety in that that says, ugh. Yeah.
It's true. Yeah.
Yeah.
So should we go to part 2 of our episode today and talk about the things that
you didn't get a chance to share the things in your head? I don't know if it's important.
Well, I feel like, one of them was the generational idea that we mentioned earlier. I was just thinking, because there's a lot we could say about generational dynamics. Another one was the anatomy of a wound. I think I just touched on it, but to make it more explicit and obvious, renewal of our mind, the importance of mind renewal, and what does that actually mean? How do you do it? I think generational would probably, we could apply that to the systemic, like systems and how systemic things operate. Those were just some of the things that along the way were popping into my mind going, gosh, that's connected to that. Oh, that's connected to that over there. I think the last one is just, I'd never thought about how much the Bible addresses leaders. Like when you mentioned the Old Testament, I've never thought about that before, but oh my gosh, it's so true. You hear so much about the leader. You hear very little about the Israelites in general, or the whomever else, the people I don't know my daughter knows the Old Testament 100 times better than me, but like Abraham, Noah, all the prophets, all the covenant keepers, Moses, they're all the leaders. And the whole thing, that's just fascinating to me. So I guess the last thing I'd say before we move on is I feel like some people will have the tendency to disqualify themselves from listening to this episode and listening to this series because they go, well, I'm not important. I mean, we've encountered that before where people have said to us, well, I don't have a podcast. This doesn't well, I'm not whatever. And there's this weird kind of disqualification thing that happens in people because they feel like I don't have a platform. Therefore, I'm not a leader. Therefore, this doesn't apply. And I just want to say, reiterate what you said. Everybody is a leader. Everybody is a leader. And it applies to all of us. We're all called to leadership. And if there's something that you go, oh, come on, stop. You're just saying that. That's the stuff that we're trying to address being activated, and it's probably valuable to look at why you're hesitant and resistant. That's the stuff that's in the way. The wounds are surfacing.
Yes. And leadership is about influencing others in a direction. And so our lives are always influencing everybody else in a direction, one way or the other.
That's really good.
And, and as Jesus said, when you're faithful in little things, will give you greater things. And so sometimes there's a responsibility at a level of leadership that's really critical.
Yes.
And when that is matured, it can grow into another level of leadership. That doesn't mean that everybody who's in leadership has matured. It means, from Jesus' standpoint, he likes to build us from the ground up.
Yes, absolutely. And he made it very clear to the one who has little and didn't handle it well, it will be taken away and given to the one who has more. I mean, Jesus, it's quite it's a bit oh gosh, that's kind of harsh, but it's this reality of how Jesus handles and responds to people who can handle authority and responsibility to bless people. Yeah.
Yes.
Okay, so here's our 3 to 4 questions that we anticipate asking all of the leaders that we're going to have on, and we know that the directions they'll take them will be different because of their spheres of influence and what they do in their lives. So here's number 1. How has brokenness affected your leadership? And so what I think is interesting about that is when I hear that question, I hear it in several different angles. 1, how have I experienced broken leaders? And how has my brokenness affected my leadership? I hear that in 2 ways. The second one is, how has healing affected your leadership? Again, I can hear that in the same 2 ways. How are you bringing healing to others in your ministry? So it's kind of the role of healing in your ministry. For you and I, that's pretty obvious, but for other people, it's not as obvious. How do you see the role of healing and leadership? In other words, what's the role? What's the place for healing and leadership? If you're at a business, right, it's harder to see, I think, there in those kind of settings. So there's the 4. How's brokenness affect your leadership? How's healing? How are you bringing healing to others in your ministry? And what's generically the role of healing and leadership?
Wow.
And thanks, listeners. That was a great episode. Yeah. Anyway.
So God give us the grace to have discretion and humility.
Yeah.
I think taking the 2 sides of that first question, I think about something I've shared a lot is my dad's leadership in the family. And I looked up to him. I loved him. I felt close to him. In many ways, he was a good dad. But his choices that he made in terms of being unfaithful to my mom and then leaving the family were devastating. And they created such deep wounds in me and in everybody in the family, including him. And it took a lot of years for that, and it's still in process of all that to be healed. So the devastating impact of leadership and the good leadership that was there, both live in my heart very deeply. And, when I look at my own life and my own leadership, I can see both within my family and then in ministry, places where my brokenness is hampered and hindered. I talk a lot about it in my books of what was happening in my marriage and in the impact of my children. And that season when I wasn't dealing with my woundedness from childhood. Yeah. And the way that I handled it was to pull away emotionally and to disconnect my heart from trust, from love. And it had an effect on me. It had an effect on Margie. It had an effect on our children. And I'm realizing that those kind of things are generational. Those things, just get handed down until they're healed. So it's very sobering to look at how many generations can be influenced in a family just from whether or not the parents are willing to, abide in Jesus and go through that healing process. So in ministry, it's been really interesting because I sometimes you're blinded to it until you see the effects. Yeah. And one of the ways that I've recognized it, and again, this goes back to some childhood wounds, is, my temperament, I didn't like conflict. It's just, for my temperament, I don't like conflict. I'm a peacemaker. I like things to be harmonious. And one of the things that I would do in the midst of intense conflict is shut down. Just kind of disconnect my heart. Yeah. And just in these last several years, just really looking at and working through the impact of that as a leader of ministry, of not appropriately dealing with issues when they got to be conflicted, and the passivity that created, and the lack of protection or the lack of affirmation or the lack of engagement in my leadership. So it's been a process. Another thing in my leadership that I've come to recognize was in terms of my response to my mom and my brothers and sisters, which is to take care of rather than deal with my own pain, just playing God rather than trusting God. And how much that influenced when people get into crisis, and, how much I've had to work through when people get into crisis, and how my immediate tendency is to come in and play God rather than trust God. And it's been a lot of growth in that area. But it's an example of, as a leader, if I don't trust, one-on-one or a whole group of people, if I don't trust that God's going to come through, then I've created this sense of expectation on the part of everybody to look to me rather than look to God.
Wow.
To be that savior.
Wow.
And so I think those are, I don't like to see them, the effects, but I think I'm becoming more aware of those effects and more aware of the places of brokenness that those originate inside of me and in my history.
Yeah. Yeah, Bob, I appreciate that. There's a lot that you're saying there that I think is just worthy of a reflection. I imagine that's going to, hopefully, that helps people connect to their own hearts. I could share very similarly with regard to family, again, it's in different ways. A lot of people know my personal story. We've shared it on the podcast, the episode with Heather, and in other places. But I would say that my wounds about that, ultimately, you could put a lot of it under the category of fear of abandonment, fear of rejection, fear of whatever, that has had a major impact on my security in stepping forward as a leader to do what's right or what's necessary. And so because I might be afraid of rejection, I'll be more timid or hesitant or try to find a way to navigate something where that doesn't get triggered. And in other words, I compromise the narrow way that leads to life for myself and other people because the woundedness terrifies me. And I'm like, I can't, how do I not do that? I would say that that's been a major part of Heather and I. I can remember times where we would be in an argument and I would literally be terrified that she was packing her bags right in that moment. And so I when you have an argument and then you kind of need some space to think about it, which to me is a normal cycle, I couldn't give Heather that space because I was so afraid, and that would just make it worse. So I didn't have the maturity to bless Heather and her need for space, and really both of our need for space. And then it would just make it worse. And all of that was coming from my leadership. And so a lot of our marital problems are very easily rooted back to my woundedness. I think that feels like an obvious statement. I think it applies to everybody, but it's really clear for me in my mind. When I think about like professionally, like my being led by other people, I think about some of my first jobs. I think about bosses that I've had, whether they be priests or not priests, or the secular organizations I've worked for, et cetera. And it's just, so obvious how I've experienced how brokenness in leaders and the various ways. So here's just two common categories: brokenness that leads to passivity and brokenness that leads to domination. And how those two areas manifest in a leader and being the recipient of that, where it's like you feel manipulated and controlled and dominated versus you feel alone and unsupported and all of that. And just like, I really appreciate how you said it, that I have to be God instead of trust God. I'm very prone to that dynamic. I call it false responsibility. I take on a responsibility that shouldn't be mine. And in my leadership as a therapist and work and accompanying people, that has been a major source of pain for the people that I've accompanied, because I've in some ways offered something I could never have come through on, but I felt responsible. And in the process left them wanting and me, kind of withered on the side of the road. And it did neither one of us any good.
Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, there's a lot of other areas that I could go into. I imagine we both could, but how about we'll go to the next one?
Yeah. And just to
please
acknowledge the sacredness of that. I mean, these are really sobering realities of not just saying it because we're on a podcast, but just as we've looked at that in our life, it's sobering. It's, just really sobering. And one of the things, just to encourage for everybody as they're listening, is as you're looking at this in your own life, not to be condemning of yourself. That's part of the healing. Maybe it leads into the next question is how does healing happen? It starts with mercy and truth.
Yeah, keep going. That's exactly where we're headed. Like, what do you mean? Yeah. Because I'm hearing you say one of the first steps to healing our brokenness, especially as leaders, is accepting the fact that we're broken and not condemning ourselves.
And not condemning ourselves, to be able to see ourselves with the eyes of Jesus in truth.
Yeah.
The Holy Spirit is a spirit of truth, but he's not a spirit of condemnation. He's a spirit of love and mercy.
Yes.
And to be able to see ourselves in those ways is what heals.
Yes.
We don't heal by condemning ourselves or by, everybody telling us how screwed up we are. Them telling us how we've affected them is important, but the condemnation doesn't help.
Yeah, absolutely.
Right? Yeah.
I think I would take that building on that idea. I know for me that I use an analogy called an orphan or a son when I'm referring to my heart. And so when I'm leading out of an orphan place versus I'm leading out of a sonship place, and really what comes up there is the fear of emptiness. So an orphan, if you imagine an orphanage, at least the stereotype, I don't mean to make this literal, but the, kind of the generalizations is that there's never enough love, there's never enough food, and everything is a competitive, scarcity-based, I have to make sure I can get what I need to survive kind of idea. Where sonship trusts in the abundance of the parent, trusts in the capacity of the parent to handle it all. And so when I'm operating as a leader, as an orphan, I worry about not having enough. And so I go into preservation mode. But when I'm the areas of my life where I've experienced healing, I can make a gift of myself and not worry and not be so panicked and so I'm a better leader. I engage in different ways. I can, say things that probably need to be said to bless people instead of being afraid of the things. And at the same time, I can say no when I should say no, but I can say yes when I need to say yes, because I'm not operating out of fear. And so healing for me has been huge. Like I remember years ago, just in my marriage, the experiences of feeling completely incapable of doing what a father and a husband needs to do. And then experiencing healing and going, oh my gosh, I can do that now. And I'm not worried and I'm not afraid. And it's like pretty dramatic. And what was the difference? Dynamics in my heart were set back in right order.
Yeah. It's a simple word, but it's confidence. It's,
there we go.
Confidence is with faith. It's like when you're in that sonship position and you're in faith, you can trust God. You can stand there and be authentic, be real, be strong, be a man, be a leader, and serve. You don't need to get from. You can give to.
That's it. I'm right back at the garden. Do I have to take to be okay, or can I trust to receive to be okay? And it's just like what you said. Like, do I trust God or do I have to be God?
Yeah. I can remember one of the most touching words of prophecy that I had, and I had it twice, was two different people coming up, and they both brought me to tears both times. One time, one of my daughters was present. And one time it was spoken to me, and another time it was spoken to Kristen, my daughter. And they said to Kristen, because of what your father has walked through in his own healing, you are all starting at a different place and don't have to go through the same thing that they went through. And the foundation is going to be for generations.
Wow.
And I heard that. And one time it was addressed to me just personally, and another time. So it was like God confirming it in front of me to my daughter. And it just so moving. And it doesn't mean that that's a done deal by any means. It's still going on to this day. But just the realization of, rather than repeat the damage that was done at the level it was done in my family as I was growing up, just, Margie and I being together, working through things, not perfectly, not without any wounds. And then the kids growing up with that deeper level of security, and then the grandkids, it's just so worth it. And, I can also see that as I've walked through in my therapy and spiritual direction, those areas of playing God and not trusting. And now how I can walk with people right into their abandonment pain and not be afraid, just have trust. It's just like, it's concerning because I see them suffering, but it's like I can be present and have confidence in God in the middle of it at a place of real deep fear. And I think there's deeper places in my own heart always that need to go into those areas, but just to see the effect of that kind of growth. And then I can lead whole groups of people into their healing with that confidence. God's going to meet us there. Even if it gets messy and uncomfortable, I didn't have that confidence years ago.
Yes. Yeah, you're, amongst all the things you're nuancing, I think something that's really beautiful that you're saying, and I know you and I do this, is we don't have a belief that we've arrived. When you're alluding to your own continuing and ongoing journey, I know that's something that's really important for the both of us. We're kind of always in the process of healing and restoration of our own hearts, no matter where we serve or where our leadership takes us. That is a core tenet of who you and I are as individuals. And I think that's just something that I think that's a really good way to go about it, is to never think that you've arrived, and to always, as a leader, be continually addressing the areas of your heart. Like, I'm back in therapy. I've been in therapy on and off for like 20 years, and people, I know people will go, oh my gosh, if I could see the therapist Jake sees, it's probably Jesus incarnate, because he's a therapist. And I'm like, you know who it is? It's a nobody that nobody knows, that nobody would ever pick. And it's so helpful because it's what God designed, right? It's not some superstar. It's not whatever. It's a nobody. And I'm experiencing really positive things from the work with this person. So yeah, I just want to highlight that the process doesn't stop. The healing process doesn't stop.
Yes. Yeah.
I can remember specific times, and I cringe, but it was where I was at, where I genuinely said out loud to people, yeah, I think I'm there. I think I'm done.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I just, it's painful, but I had no idea. I thought, like, I've gone through a major season. And it wasn't like a lot of people go, oh, right, and then God came with the lightning and thunder and flattened you. And no, that's not at all what happened, because he's kind. It was a slow process of deeper revelation, of deeper brokenness. And I was very humbled, but never shamed. The Father never shamed me in that extremely prideful statement. But yeah.
Sobering. Yeah. I don't know if everybody's been there, but I've been there. In fact, even before I started my healing process, I thought didn't need any.
Yeah,
you know?
I hear it.
Yeah. That denial.
Yeah. I think the third question is something we can probably just skip because I feel like it's somewhat obvious. Like, how are you bringing healing to others in your ministry? It's like, that is our ministry.
Yeah. And our guests, that's going to be a great question because they're going to, so many different ways that each of the guests are going to be able to do that.
Yeah. Maybe we can land the plane with the final question. And I think we might have touched on already. I can't think of anything off the top of my head, but maybe you will. How do you see the role of healing and leadership? In other words, what's the role of healing and leadership? And to me, I would just say, well, everything we just said, it's really important and you're never done. But anything come to mind?
Yeah. One of the things is I think that a good leader is always healing. That is, it's not so much what you talk about, although it comes out that way, but it's in who you are and what you do. So just in the way that it's only love that heals, it's the truth lived out in love that heals.
Yes.
And Jesus healed everyone who he encountered because of his living the truth in love and that self-giving love.
Yes.
And so as a leader, the more free we are in our own healing process, the more we live that out with the people around us, healing takes place. So that's the primary way. But I also think there's specific ways, depending on the role in the ministry, and each of our guests are going to have a different expression of this. Mm-hmm. But I think there's also specific ways in which we're intentional about the healing of everybody that we work with. And so in our ministry, it's one of the prerequisites for somebody to be a part of our ministry, whether it's as a speaker, and it's a different level of responsibility as a speaker, or as somebody in the office, but everybody's in a healing process. Everybody's conscious of that.
Yes.
And they're attracted to the ministry because of that, but they're also, if I went through, and I'm not going to do this, but if I went through person after person and I could lay out their healing process, I'm just deeply amazed at the courage of the individuals and their willingness and how they've gotten into some hard places. And being around this material, being around this ministry just heightens that and requires that. And at the same time, all of us in the ministry still need a lot of healing. And, starting here, all of us need more healing because we are seeing the effects of where that healing hasn't been over time and how much that's influenced us as an organization, us as a ministry. So I just think it's an ongoing conscious deliberation. And I would like to see it for everybody everywhere. Probably you would too.
Yeah. I appreciate it. I mean, Bob, that's one of the things I really love about your ministry and just who you are is that healing for you is not something that you do. It's a central tenet of the gospel. And that for me has been a really helpful formation piece where I'm notorious for putting healing as kind of a bit of a sideshow thing that you got to do to get back into the gospel game, if you will. But no, it's actually the centerpiece. It's one of the central tenets of the gospel. And Jesus makes that quite clear. And, there's various things that in your courses and whatnot where you talk about it and show how it's very clearly the way that the church, she actually says the same thing. Mm-hmm. So to me, the role of healing it's an essential part of the gospel. And so if you're a leader, then staying in that place is essential because if you don't, the gospel's not being lived out and something else is.
Right.
And so I would say as soon as somebody avoids healing, red flags go up like crazy for me because what are they hiding? Why are they not willing to go there? Do they have the circles in which that they can address these things? Because I've seen it, I'm sure you have too, so many times where people get defensive and push away this whole healing stuff. And I go, I'm fine. You don't have to do it the Jake way, the Bob way, the Restore the Glory way. I don't care about that. But are you in the posture and in the process? And if not, I feel the desire to exhort that individual because it's not just about you. There's a lot of people following you. and you have a lot of
Yeah.
influence. And Jesus is so clear about this. Really, it's this gangster kind of image. If you cause one of these little ones to sin, it's better if a millstone was tied around your neck and you were thrown in the river. Like, that's right out of
Wow.
Godfather, right? Like, that is like wild. And that's his response to leaders, right? Like, cinder block into the river, that would be better. And so I just go, this is not small. This is not insignificant. Now, usually that comes out of woundedness, that defensiveness, but nevertheless, leadership doesn't earn you privilege. It's not about privilege and power. It's about greater gift. It actually costs more. There's less privilege because there's more people to serve, right? Like, it's not glorious, true leadership. Anyway, so final thoughts? Or
I think you said it there, and it goes back to what is true leadership. The greatest among you must serve the rest, and it's a constant process of humility, which is dealing with reality. And part of that reality is the areas of our lives that aren't life-giving, and allowing, even if it's difficult, allowing ourselves to be humble enough to say, Jesus, I need you here because I recognize this place in me that's not life-giving, and I want to be life-giving. I want people to experience you when they experience me. And I know in this particular way, in this particular place, the old dead me is creating death around me and hasn't now yet become an open wound of healing like your wounds, resurrected wounds. And, that's the desire, is that everything in my life could be transformed in that way. And, it's not false humility to say that I'm a long way from that. And I desire that for me, for you, for everybody else.
Well, listeners, we've got a fun series coming up, some really cool guests, so we really want to encourage you to tune in. And hey, if maybe there's some leaders that in your world or in your life, or some peers who are leaders, right? Everybody's a leader, so maybe you want to share this with them and say, hey, maybe we should break this down in our men's group, our women's group, our parish group, or whatever. This is really important. So that's why we're doing it, because we feel like it's important to share and to promote healing in leadership. So stay tuned. We're excited about where we're going to go, and we're praying for you. Please keep us in your prayers, and thanks for all your support. And until next time, God bless you.